Hello everyone, this is Jennifer Wilson from the University of Illinois. Welcome to the March edition of the Joint Centers webinar, an opportunity to hear from researchers at DRISC, RISO, and WINS. We'll get right into it today with some getting started logistics. We have 3 presenters. They will each give 15-minute presentations and we'll have about 5 minutes for Q&A. So please do be thinking about what you'd like to ask our presenters and submit those via the question/chat box. And this webinar will be recorded and posted on our Joint Centers website after the fact for sharing with a larger audience of collaborators. Today we have our 3 presenters from DRISC. We have Tyler Kane, the University of New Hampshire. We have Michal Zivel from the University of Texas. And from RISO, we have Ty Boreski from UBC. All right, I'm going to hand the presentership over to Tyler to kick us off. All right, I have to unmute Tyler. There we go.
Perfect. All right. So we good to go?
Yes, you are. Go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you. So thank you, everybody, for taking the time to listen to my presentation. My name is Tyler Kane, presenting on behalf of University of New Hampshire, the DRISC Center, and my advisor, Dr. James Malley. So my presentation is titled Taking Credit, and it's a case study of a UV system to expand applications of virus inactivation and increase efficiency and sustainability. So a little bit of what I'll be talking about today, basically some background information about UV, basically what the drivers of this research really are, and then I'll go into the pilot study which I'm managing and talk about some of my initial results and some future implications of this research. So as you all probably know, UV light inactivates rather than kills microbes based on the photons from the light interfering with the replication process. So this means that it's a physical disinfectant, and unlike chlorine, it's not a chemical disinfection that will leave a residual. So it's becoming an increasingly popular option for a lot of public water systems. And as you can see from the figure on the top right, the cross-section of a typical UV unit, we have the lamps represented by the blue lines there. There are sleeves around the lamp to protect it from water hammer. There's a wiper that will clean them occasionally, and then importantly, there's also some sensors that will measure the irradiance or the power coming from the lamps themselves. So in general, there are 2 different types of UV systems. There are some other emerging technologies like LEDs and such, but the major market players are low pressure and medium pressure. And the distinct difference between the 2 is that low pressure is monochromatic, meaning that across the UV spectrum, across the UV wavelengths, it only emits a high output of irradiance at roughly one wavelength at 254 nanometers. And it was designed this way because studies have shown that microbes will get inactivated relatively efficiently at this wavelength. Now, medium pressure is polychromatic, so it emits multiple different levels of irradiances across that whole wavelength spectrum. This comes at a cost. It's not as energy efficient, but there are some advantages, which I'll get into in a little bit. So before any UV unit is used in a public water system, it needs to be validated. And this is done by the vendor or a third party. And basically, you want to really look at it in terms of the UV light dosing the water, and we can think about that in terms of the intensity of light times the time that intensity is occurring over that water matrix. So this equation, however, is really only reliable at the lab scale, because if you think about a UV unit in the field or in a public water treatment plant, a lot of things can change. The flow rate can change, the power level can change, the UVT, which for those of you that don't know, UVT is the UV transmittance of the water. So a 90% UVT basically means 90% of the light is getting through and 10% is being absorbed by that water matrix. So all those things can change in the field. So we do this validation at the lab scale to be able to really understand the performance of the unit in the field. So to do that, we have bench scale testing, which basically you take a challenge microorganism, which is like a surrogate that acts like what you're trying to target, and under a very specific set of conditions. You put it under a UV light with a known intensity for a known amount of time, and you do this for many different times. And you can develop what's called the dose response curve, as seen on the bottom left of this slide. So for certain doses, you're going to measure certain log inactivations of before and after being exposed to that UV light. So then you can also go ahead and do full-scale reactor testing, where you inject that same challenge or surrogate microorganism under a variety of different conditions. You do dozens of tests, and you measure the effluent level. And with that log inactivation that you saw in full-scale testing, you can relate that back to the dose response curve that you developed in the first step. And you can kind of see on the figure to the right, you relate that log inactivation to a reduction equivalent dose. And this basically just is like a verified way to know how the system is performing in the field. So when I mentioned the challenge microorganism that is selected, that's a really important concept, because it really needs to be similar to the pathogen that you're targeting. So if you're targeting Giardia or crypto, for example, you want to use a challenge microorganism in validation that is very similar to it. And what I mean by that is it has a similar action spectrum. So it has similar wavelength sensitivity across the wavelength spectrum. So if you can see from the figure in the middle here, you can see how the challenge and the target pathogen have similar action spectrum across that range of wavelengths. And this is good because when you're in the lab scale and you're using these challenge microorganisms that are a lot easier to work with, you can say with decent confidence that this is how it would act on adenovirus or Giardia or crypto out in the field. So it's a really important concept, especially for medium pressure reactors, because you want to make sure it's very similar. So now, with that background info, I'll begin to talk about some of the drivers of this research. Different regulations like the groundwater rule, surface water rule, and some others say that public water systems need to provide 4 log disinfection of viruses. And in terms of UV, the target virus in this case is adenovirus, and it's selected because it's relatively resistant to UV light. So if we can inactivate 4 log adenovirus, we can be fairly certain that there are no other viruses present. So this equates to a 4 log disinfection of adenovirus relates to a 186 millijoule per centimeter squared dose of UV light at 254 nanometers. And that's a really high power level. To put this into perspective, Giardia and crypto would take roughly 12 millijoules per centimeter squared to get a 3 log inactivation credit. So this kind of put UV in a bad position in this case. It's actually not listed as a best available technology for virus inactivation. So a lot of small public water systems that have virus issues or are susceptible to the groundwater rule or surface water rule, they resort to using only chemical disinfectants because UV just doesn't make sense. It's not energy efficient in this case. So that's what'll tend to happen. But the issue there is that there are some small water systems that have a lot of disinfection byproduct issues, or DBPs, when the chlorine can react with some natural organic matter and create a lot of unintended byproducts. And these are regulated too, as you can see from the figure on the right. So a lot of public water systems are kind of in a catch-22 where they need to chlorinate a certain amount, but they also need to stay under this disinfection byproducts limit. So, however, 2 emerging concepts of this that were driving this research was that recent microbial research that has shown that adenovirus is much more sensitive to lower wavelengths than we previously thought. The challenge microorganism, the surrogate that was used, has shown to be more resistant than adenovirus at lower wavelengths. So we thought that adenovirus was much more resistant at these lower wavelengths, when in fact it actually isn't. So in theory, if lower wavelengths in the 200 to 240 region could dose adenovirus, it would be able to inactivate it at the 4 log level much more efficiently than we previously thought. And the second major component to this is that the UV units were previously blind to this region, the 200 to 240 nanometers. It's kind of interesting that the sensors in the reactor that measure the irradiance, none of them were reliable below 240 nanometers. So in all our validation processes, we just assumed that no action occurred below 240 because our sensor technology couldn't really measure those wavelengths reliably. So both of those things have changed. There's a lot of potential here now because Trojan has developed new sensor technologies. New sensors are coming out from new vendors too that supposedly can measure this range. And we also know now that adenovirus can be inactivated much more efficiently in this range. So if we can theoretically inactivate adenovirus more efficiently, and we can monitor these low wavelengths to ensure that they're going through the water matrix, medium pressure UV units can run much more efficiently and become an option for a lot of small systems where they previously were not. So that kind of brings us to the pilot study that's ongoing right now. Project 1, Activity 6 of the D-RISC Center is basically 3 pilot studies. All 3 of them are in New Hampshire. And the one I'm focusing on for my research is in Bethlehem, New Hampshire. And you can see where it is on the figure to the top right there. And basically, the question we're looking to ask is, what if medium pressure units could take credit for these low wavelengths? Can the sensors that are in that system reliably measure the low wavelengths? And are they measuring them at a level that we can really see and consider accurate? And in that case, if we can potentially, then that kind of proves to us that adenovirus can be inactivated much more efficiently and at a lower power level for UV units. So the primary objectives are to see if the low wavelengths can be measured. Are they accurate? And if so, what are the benefits for systems that can take credit for these low wavelengths? We can think about the reduction in the formation of disinfection byproducts for systems that don't need to use as much chlorine. We can think about the reduction in energy usage for taking credit for these low wavelengths because now you don't need to use as much power to get that 4-log disinfection credit. So there's a whole host of advantages and implications here. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to mention too is that the chart on the bottom right here kind of shows Bethlehem's disinfection byproduct issue. These are haloacetic acids, and the red line there is the regulatory limit. You can see how quickly they're exceeding that on many occasions. The second data point is just the end of the reservoir. So they're really in a tough situation with needing to chlorinate to disinfect, but also staying under that limit. So obviously you can improve your treatment processes, but that's often very costly. So an option for them potentially is medium pressure UV if the low wavelengths can be accounted for. So what am I doing to kind of answer all these questions? Basically, I'm gathering a lot of data. So the programmable logic controller on the UV system at Bethlehem, it's basically just a computer, measures water quality parameters every 5 minutes. And I collected about 9 months of data. So it'll measure the flow, the UV, the water, the power level, and also what each of the sensors are reading. So 2 of the sensors are regular wavelength sensors as in any other UV unit, and then 2 other sensors that are these innovative low wavelength ones. So I can monitor the system's performance over time to see how well the low wavelength sensors are responding under certain conditions. I'll also go up to Bethlehem occasionally and sample myself to get a full wavelength scan and see what the UVT is like across the whole UV wavelength spectrum as opposed to just at 254. So the idea here is that I'm looking to challenge the sensors under different conditions to see if they would respond to a level that we would expect. So in order to do that, we can look at the long-term data. This represents the month of June. Basically, the gray and orange lines represent the low wavelength sensors and how well they're tracking the irradiance from the UV unit. So basically, you can see that they're tracking well with the regular sensors. We actually did a manual spike on the 7th, as you can see in that jump there, to see if they would respond to that increase in power level, and they did pretty effectively and over time too. And also another way to challenge the sensors is to change the reactor sleeves. Remember, the sleeves are what kind of goes around the lamp to protect it from water hammer and other issues as well. There are certain sleeves that are actually designed to block lower wavelengths. So we installed those with the question of, okay, when we put these on, we should see a drop in the low wavelength sensors, but not in the regular ones, because the low wavelength sensors should theoretically only be capturing the low wavelengths. And as you can see from this figure here, on December 8th, when we changed the sleeves, you see that response in the green and red lines of the low wavelength sensors. You see it kind of drop in relation to the other sensors too. So that's a good sign in that situation. And then we can further analyze this and say, did we see a drop in response similar to what we would expect? So this graph here, the green curve basically represents the sensor response area. So the area under that curve is what the sensor is picking up in terms of wavelengths. The blue line is what's being blocked by the UVT of the water, and the purple line is what's being blocked by the UVT of the sleeve. So we can kind of do a wavelength balance and just see if the percent reduction that we're seeing in the field is similar to what we would expect in theory. And in doing that, obviously, a lot of statistics needs to be done to determine, is the percent difference in means from before and after these situations what we would expect? Is it different? By how much? And all those questions are definitely important in this research. So that's ongoing right now. That's kind of what I've been up to. And this is also going to be done for 3 different sleeve changes and a change of lamps too, to see if that, if newer lamps produce a higher response rate in those sensors. So, and also looking at the long-term response level too. Do they, are they accurate for a long period of time? Because that's very important if you're going to be validating these UV units for other systems. So some other components that I'm looking at too is more in-depth water quality monitoring. So some of the samples I take will take back to my lab and do chlorine and chloramine demand and decay curves just to see how quickly the free chlorine would be used up in the system. Right now, Bethlehem only has slow sand filtration and chlorination, along with the pilot unit right before chlorination too. So we've seen a high demand in chloramine. And some other components too. This is my last slide, and this is kind of the crux of what I want to do with my research. Basically, what are the implications if we can take credit for these low wavelengths, if we can prove that they are entering the water matrix, reaching the sensors, and thus, in theory, inactivating adenovirus, what are the implications of that for other systems? So basically, you can think about it in terms of energy savings, as I mentioned. The power level can be reduced because we just opened up a whole range of UV spectrum that we weren't accounting for beforehand. So the power of UV units can be reduced, as you can see in the figure on the left. This is an example from our sister pilot unit in Hampstead. When you install the UV unit, obviously the power level for water treated goes up, but once you take credit, in theory, for these low wavelengths, that orange line represents the power level that you can drop to. And Trojan estimated for Bethlehem roughly a 34% decrease in power usage. So that's a pretty big implication for small systems. And the other thing I also wanted to look at too is kind of a more holistic approach to what the implications are. You can think solely about energy usage, and then looking at that graph to the left, you could say, oh, well, why install UV at all? You're just increasing the energy usage. But I also wanted to show the reduction in human toxicity risk associated with installing a UV unit. So as I mentioned, when you install UV, you can lessen your chlorine load. And for a lot of small water systems that have disinfection byproduct issues, they would see a reduction in these harmful disinfection byproducts after installing UV. So I also want to do a full life cycle assessment on comparing the before and after of, so your energy usage before may be low, but your DVP risk is high, and then you have the vice versa after the fact. So once you install UV, you have a slight increase in power, but hopefully a large reduction in disinfection byproduct formation potential. So there's a lot of big implications with taking credit for low wavelengths. It can really change the way that UV systems are validated, but obviously in order to do that, we need to make sure the sensors are working as they are supposed to. So that's kind of what I'm working on now. That's the culmination of my research thus far. Here at UNH, my advisor and I are really excited about it, and it's been going well so far. So at that point, I guess I'd like to open it up to any questions you might have. Thank you for listening, and if you think of anything later, definitely take my email down, and feel free to email me with any questions you might have in the future. So with that, I'm going to change presenter back to
Yes, that would be just fine. We don't have any questions for you at this time. But if anybody does have questions for Tyler, they can continue to submit them, and we'll answer them later.
All right, sounds great. So I will hand over the presentation to Mikkel.
Yes, that's correct.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, everybody, for listening. I appreciate it.
Okay, good morning.
Great, thank you.
My name is, okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, good morning. My name is Michal Zival, and I'm going to be speaking to you about a part of one of our WINS projects, which is on the removal of trace organic contaminants as a secondary benefit in standard aerobic versus nitrifying drinking water biofilters. I'd like to acknowledge all of my co-authors on this work who are both from UT and UMass. This project that I'm going to be speaking to you about is part of WINS Project D, which is on biological management of nitrogenous chemicals in small drinking water treatment systems. And I'd like to start out by telling you about the primary microbial processes in the two biofilters that we used in our study. So the first is typically called aerobic biofilters. In our case, I'm going to be referring to it as standard aerobic. And this is where there's oxidation of organics to carbon dioxide by heterotrophic bacteria. And then the second group of biofilters were nitrifying. And in addition to oxidizing organics, they also oxidize ammonia to nitrite and then to nitrate by nitrifying microorganisms. And there's a fairly large body of literature that shows that aerobic biofilters have a secondary benefit of removing trace organic contaminants. So these are contaminants such as personal care products, pharmaceuticals, and pesticides. And there's much more limited research that shows the impacts of having nitrification in the biofilters on removal of trace organics. So that's really the focus of our work. What is known about removal of trace organics in all aerobic biofilters, both standard and nitrifying, is that the removal mechanism is through two primary ways. So the first is through sorption onto the media, so the packed bed media such as granular activated carbon, or onto the main organics in the system, which could be natural organic matter, which is NOM, the microbial biomass, or what's secreted from the microbes, which is the extracellular polymeric substances, or EPS. And the second mechanism is through biodegradation. And since the concentration of trace organics is so much lower than that of the NOM, the biodegradation is either through secondary utilization, where the microbes do still grow from the process, or through co-metabolism, where they don't grow from the process and it's just fortuitous reactions where the trace organics bump into enzymes that happen to be there and degrade. So this is a pretty large project, and so there's really many hypotheses, but what I'm going to focus on today are the following two hypotheses. The first is that different sources of NOM will lead to differences in the removal of trace organics. And the second is that nitrification will allow for more rapid acclimation to trace organics and also greater removal of trace organics. And the reasoning for this second hypothesis was twofold. First, by having more nitrifiers, we hypothesized that this would allow for greater areas on which to sorb from the increased biomass and the increased EPS. The second reason is that by having these nitrifiers, we would expect that there would also be greater biological removal because of greater diversity and concentration of both microorganisms and enzymes present in the biofilters. So over here is what our laboratory setup looked like. And we had 4 different conditions. So we had 4 influent tanks feeding 4 different treatment trains. And each train consisted of 2 biofilters in series, each packed with granular activated carbon. And each of the biofilters had an empty bed contact time of 3 minutes. So each train had an empty bed contact time of 6 minutes. And so now I'm going to tell you about the 4 different feeds into the different trains. So for the source of NOM, the natural organic matter, 2 of the feeds were surface water and the other 2 were groundwater. And we wanted to take advantage of the fact that we were running a a laboratory system, not a pilot, and take out one of the common confounding factors in interpreting trace organics removal, which is that you could have it in a natural water, you would have variation in the composition and concentration of the NOM over time, with mostly with seasonal changes. So what we did is, ahead of the experiment, we concentrated all of the NOM that we would need for the entire experiment, and then twice a week we reconstituted this NOM to the same concentration each time. And then in one of the surface waters and one of the groundwater feeds, we had ammonia, so these were the nitrifying biofilters, and then in one of each there was no ammonia, so these were the standard aerobic biofilters. And then in all of the feeds, we had a suite of 10 trace organics, which are listed on the left, and these were selected based on a variety of factors, including that there was a range of ease of biodegradation from very biodegradable to recalcitrant based on the literature. So we ran this experiment for 305 days, and there were 6 stages. What I'm going to talk to you about here are 3 of the stages, the ones that are in bold, and I'll tell you a little bit about those stages now. So in the first stage, we inoculated all of the biofilters with the same groundwater that was also contaminated with ammonia, so that there would be naturally present nitrifiers. And the reason that we did this was to remove another confounding factor from later on interpreting the trace organics data, which was that if we had different sources of starting microorganisms, and that could account for the differences that we saw between the different trains. So we wanted to start with the same source through all the trains. The next stage that I want to tell you about is the 3rd stage, which was acclimation to steady state removal of trace organics. And this was the bulk of our experiment, 237 days. And then the last stage that I want to tell you about is stage 6, which was where we assessed the biodegradation versus sorption, and this was through addition of azide, which inhibits microbial activity. Now, as I said, this was a pretty big study, so there were many analyses that we carried out, including a whole range of standard water quality parameters, other analytical analyses, and microbial community analysis. Today, I'm just going to talk to you almost exclusively about the trace organics data. But first, just very briefly, I want to convince you that we really did have nitrification throughout the entirety of the experiment. So I'm going to show you that data. So over here on the y-axis, you see the ammonia removal over time for the surface water feed and groundwater feed. And what you can see is that there was 100% removal of ammonia within 1 week. And within an additional 2 weeks, all of that removal, which was actually being converted all the way, oxidized all the way to nitrate, was taking place in the first biofilter in each of the trains, so the 3-minute empty bed contact time, and that happened for basically the entire experiment. Okay, so the rest of the data that you're going to see is going to be the trace organics. And I want to start out with a snapshot of the trace organics at the end of stage 3, so presumably where we had steady state removal of trace organics, just to give you an idea of what it looked like. So we have here the percent removal for that whole suite of 10 trace organics, and this is for all of the biofilters. And what I want to point out here is that all of the biofilters were, as expected, effective at removing the trace organics. These were to varying extents. Many of them removed it fully, some of them just partially. Now, to really answer our hypotheses, we have to look at the temporal changes during that acclimation phase, and we'll do that in a moment. But right before we get to that, I want to jump to the final stage of our experiment where we assess the biodegradation versus sorption, because I think that having an understanding of the mechanism that was carrying out the removal is just a helpful thing to keep in mind. So the removal, it looked pretty similar for all of the biofilters. So I just chose over here a representative case. So I chose the surface water nitrifying biofilters. And again, you have the percent removal for all of the trace organics. And here we have in blue the steady state removals, and in gray with the addition of azide. So the more gray, the more of the removal was via sorption. And in the solid colors is for the 3-minute empty bed contact time, and where you see where it's hashed, that's including the second biofilter, so what was happening in the second one in the series, so with the total of the 6-minute empty bed contact time. And what we found is that there was really this nice range of removal from biodegradation versus sorption, and we could classify it into 4 categories. So the first category was thiabendazole, which was removed almost essentially via sorption. The second category was estrone and caffeine, which was mostly through sorption, but some biodegradation. The third group was diclofenac, naproxen, and atenolol, which were removed both by sorption and biodegradation. And the fourth group were gemfibrozil, geosmin, 2-MiB, and DEET, which were removed mostly via biodegradation. Okay, so now on to the acclimation to steady state removal, while considering the removal of the biodegradation versus sorption. So the first group of trace organics that I want to show you are the ones that supported hypothesis 1, that different non-sources will lead to differences in the removal of trace organics. And before we actually get to the data, I just want to walk you through what one of these graphs looks like, since they're all going to have the same format. So again, we have the percent removal on the y-axis, and it's going to be for whatever compound we're looking at, and time on the x-axis. And in blue, we have the surface water biofilters, in red the groundwater, solid lines are nitrifying, dashed are standard aerobic. And so what we found is that the trace organics that were affected by the NOM source, most of them benefited from the surface water NOM, except for one, which I'll talk about in a moment. So, but for the surface water NOM, we see for 2-MiB that while all of the compounds reached 100% removal, the surface water biofilters both reached it quite a bit sooner, at least 50 days sooner than for the groundwater. For gemfibrozil, we see that there was more removal in the end from the surface water, in the surface water biofilters compared to the groundwater, at least 40%. And we also see greater removal, although to a much lesser extent, for the surface water biofilters with diclofenac and for removal of naproxen. And over here again, I'm showing you the biodegradation versus sorption just to sort of give you an idea. It's somewhat speculation what the implications are, but I think it's helpful to just kind of keep it in mind. For caffeine, there was mostly a benefit for the surface water biofilters at the 3-minute empty bed contact time, but it was less apparent for the 6-minute empty bed contact time. And I want to also tell you about the in one of the other biofilter, or one of the compounds, there was actually more removal in the groundwater biofilters, and which I'll tell you about actually in just a couple minutes from now. So next we're going to go on to the compounds, the trace organics removal that supported or refuted hypothesis 2, that nitrification will allow for more rapid acclimation to trace organics and greater removal of trace organics. So first, there were 3 trace organics that showed faster or better removal in the nitrifying biofilters. And the first one was in 2-MiB again. So over here you can see that the solid lines, which were for the 2 nitrifying, that they acclimated more rapidly than the standard aerobic. And for geosmin, you can see that here too, the nitrifying reached higher removal than for standard aerobic, although it's not quite as clear. If we go to the 3-minute, you can actually see a more stark difference for 2-MiB, but for the 3-minute for geosmin, we actually can't see this benefit of nitrification. For thiabendazole, you see that there was more removal in the nitrifying biofilters. And I think this is especially interesting because over here this was mostly through sorption. So this was really a case where there was probably more NOM in the nitrifying biofilters, or more biomass and more EPS that on which for the thiabendazole could sorb. And this is the case, the thiabendazole, where we expect that the groundwater was actually the reason why you're not seeing over here the values for groundwater is that actually before it even entered the biofilter, so just in the tanks, we couldn't detect any thiabendazole. So presumably all the thiabendazole was being sorbed onto the groundwater NOM. In the 6-minute empty bed contact time, we actually don't see benefit anymore of the nitrifying over the standard aerobic. And there were 2 trace organics that had higher removal for standard aerobic as compared to nitrifying, which we found really interesting. The first was tenolol, and you can see very clearly that the total amount of removal for the standard aerobic was a fair amount higher than for the nitrifying consistently. And we can also see it a little bit less clearly, but you can still see it for the 3-minute empty bed contact time for caffeine, although we couldn't see this anymore at the 6-minute empty bed contact time. So the last group that I want to tell you about are the trace organics that did not provide evidence for either hypothesis, and there were 2 compounds in this category. The first one was DEET, and this is pretty interesting because all of the DEET was removed via biodegradation, but regardless of the biofilter, they all seem to acclimate more or less in the same way and reach 100% removal. And in contrast, estrone was mostly removed via sorption. And from the first sampling point of the trace organics, we actually can't see any difference between the different biofilters. So just to summarize the conclusions based on our hypotheses, so for our first hypothesis that different NOM sources will lead to differences in trace organics removal, we saw that this was true sometimes. So it was true for 6 of the trace organics. Most of the time surface water NOM yielded faster acclimation or higher removal. And in one case, the groundwater NOM yielded a higher removal. For our second hypothesis that nitrification will allow for more rapid acclimation to trace organics and greater removal of trace organics, this is true only sometimes. So what we found is that out of our suite of 10 compounds, we found this clearly for 3 of the trace organics, but in fact the standard aerobic biofilters yielded greater removal for 2 of the trace organics, and 5 of them we couldn't see any impact. So what we found from this is that both of these hypotheses are true in some cases, not true in others, and it really is dependent on the trace organics. But regardless, for the most part, having nitrification is not going to affect your removal all that much and could, in fact, help it. I just want to tell you our next exciting step is going to be analyzing our microbial community analysis and correlating what we find with this, which microbes ended up being in the various biofilters with our hypotheses and with our other data. So thank you, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
All right, we do not have any questions at this time. In fact, we have a crazy spammer who's submitting questions. We've had hundreds of random questions submitted by a person I keep kicking out, and they keep rejoining. So it's the strangest thing ever in the entire world. But unfortunately, no questions yet for our presenters. So you can transfer the presentation to Ty.
Thank you very much.
All right, go ahead.
Yeah, hold on, I'm trying to get this screen set up here.
Oh,
okay.
sure, no problem.
Hello, my name is Ty Boreski, and I'm with Rizzo WaterNet. I'm a PhD candidate in civil engineering at UBC Okanagan, supervised by Dr. Rehan Sadiq and Dr. Manuel Rodriguez. Today I'll be presenting my research titled Risk-Based Performance Benchmarking, a drinking water assessment framework incorporating spatiotemporal water quality variability and degrees of compliance, non-compliance. In this presentation, I'm going to briefly cover the motivations for this research, risk and fuzzy sets, fuzzy logic, and the idea of incorporating these methodologies into drinking water assessment practices. I'm then going to move forward with a demonstration comparing this approach to a traditional water quality index-based approach, and then finish up with the results, limitations, and future study opportunities. Performance benchmarking refers to the process of measuring performance either internally within an organization or externally against either competitors or non-competitors. In terms of drinking water, it can allow decision makers to plan and gauge performance against similar municipalities, incentivize the concept of continuous performance improvement, and create transparency for consumers. It can also be a useful tool for identifying operational gaps and best management practices to remedy problems. Traditionally, drinking water performance assessment is binary, based on either exceedances of individual performance indicators or using a modified water quality index, which aggregates multiple indicators to quantify water quality with a score usually between 0 and 100. When using this binary assessment approach, it can create misleading and potentially inaccurate benchmarking data, which can result in decision makers inadequately allocating resources for improvement. This is especially an issue in smaller systems where human and financial resource constraints are already well established. I use this simplified example of two identical drinking water supply systems to highlight the deficiencies with current drinking water quality assessment. On top, you can see System 1, where there are 3 water quality exceedances in the city center. In System 2, there are 6 water quality exceedances in less populated areas. Traditionally, without incorporating spatial consequence, System 1 is outperforming System 2. However, when integrating the concept of consequence in terms of affected population, System 2 may not be performing worse and almost certainly not twice as bad as System 1. So by incorporating this consequence factor, we can get a better picture with better data resolution of overall drinking water performance. So to address the issues associated with the traditional drinking water assessment and associated benchmarking, I've developed a framework quantifying spatiotemporal variability and degrees of compliance, non-compliance through the use of risk assessment and fuzzy inference systems, with the overall goal of just building better benchmarks. This presentation is mostly focused on kind of step 4 through 6 of my framework, as the first few steps are just kind of associated with the selection of performance indicators, the category, breaking it down into categories, and then acquiring the necessary data. So in order to move beyond the paradigm of binary assessment, risk-based assessment methodologies can be incorporated. So risk is commonly understood as probability of an occurrence and the severity of the consequence of the event. And so all risk-based approaches face uncertainties associated with data limitations, sampling error, and vagueness in expert opinion, which is particularly true when quantifying risk in smaller systems, which often rely on one part-time staff member for operations, monitoring, and troubleshooting. So by incorporating fuzzy set theory, we can help address these uncertainties along with the imprecision associated with measuring performance based on singular water quality guidelines or standards. The theory of fuzzy set refers to the concept in which everything is considered based on degrees of certainty, which is in contrast to traditional crisp sets where it's based on binary logic where statements are either true or false with nothing in between. The graphic on the left highlights the difference between crisp sets and fuzzy sets, with crisp sets being characterized as either 1, true, or 0, false, while fuzzy sets have degrees of membership between 1 and 0. On the right graphic, crisp and fuzzy logic is illustrated in terms of free residual chlorine concentration and linguistic risk values. So traditional logic dictates crisp thresholds between descriptors. For example, medium risk of turbidity can be classified as between 0.75 and 2.25 NTUs. And I also throw up the regulatory logic in here, just showing that basically things are broken down into either acceptable or as an exceedance. And fuzzy logic takes it kind of a step further by integrating degrees of certainty. It incorporates partial memberships when describing performance. For example, at 2.25 NTUs turbidity, risk has partial membership as both medium and high. So using fuzzy logic, we can build fuzzy rules, which from a simplified standpoint consist of input variables and corresponding values of outputs, and are aggregated using logical operators. By combining these rules into fuzzy inference systems, also known as fuzzy rule-based systems, we can incorporate multiple inputs to generate a fuzzy output using both qualitative and quantitative information. The proposed framework is built on a bottom-to-top hierarchy consisting of 6 generations, which allows for the possibility of quantifying risk at a high level, such as Generation 1 overall water system performance, or also allows you to have additional resolution for determining risk at a lower level, such as the risk associated with trihalomethanes in a given system. So each generation is kind of defined as, like I mentioned earlier, Generation 1 is overall drinking water quality risk. Generation 2 is risk of a performance category, so for example, risk of chemical performance indicators. Generation 3 is the risk of individual performance indicators in a given category. So an example of that is just looking at risk of turbidity in a system. Generation 4 is the seasonal risk of an individual performance indicator. So that's specifically looking at risk of something like turbidity during the spring, the runoff season. Generation 5 refers to the seasonal performance of an individual indicator at a given point in the distribution network. So that's looking at the winter risk of turbidity in the middle of a supply system. And then finally, Generation 6 is the individual sample in a given season of an individual indicator at a given point in the distribution network. So this is basically the input to the rest of the hierarchy. So in order to quantify performance using a fuzzy inference system, the first step is the establishment of a universe of discourse, which represents all possible input values to a fuzzy system. So in this slide, I'm highlighting specific chemical indicators, including free residual chlorine and 2 commonly monitored disinfection byproducts, THM4 and HAA5. And the associated universe of discourse is either based on literature or water quality guidelines and regulations. And basically, it's just to provide additional detail beyond just the acceptance of meeting standards or being an exceedance and being above the guidelines or standards. So this table quantitatively summarizes what the water quality criteria, the spatial criteria, and the temporal criteria for the selected fuzzy descriptors looks like. So for example, indicators described as low represents water quality below standards. Spatially, it represents water quality issues affecting the least amount of people. And temporally, this is water quality issues arising when the use is at its lowest, for example, during the winter. And the results from running information through this can be used for functional performance benchmarking to compare performance against a defined benchmark and directly or indirectly against similar drinking water systems. So for utilities performing well below a benchmark, you know that major improvements are needed. For utilities performing slightly below a benchmark, major or minor improvements are needed depending on the technological and behavioral upgrades already in place. And then so for utilities performing better than the benchmark, the ones performing well, their priority shifts to continuous performance improvement in terms of priorities such as customer satisfaction and operator reliability. So I demonstrated this performance assessment framework using data from a 2011 campaign of 8 small systems in Newfoundland and Labrador and Quebec, and these using surface water sources. These provinces were chosen as they have vastly differing provincial regulations on water treatment. In Newfoundland and Labrador, small systems are simple, usually with just chlorine being added to raw surface water. And in Quebec, generally provincial regulations require filtration in addition to disinfection. I then modeled the framework using MATLAB Simulink and compared the results to the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment Water Quality Index, modified for drinking water purposes. So before moving further in the next few slides, I have to note that in its current form, the quantification of spatial and temporal risk in this framework is simplified and generic for multiple purposes, but it does have the potential to be expanded and tailored for individual utilities or a group of utilities in a benchmark. So for the proposed framework, spatial risk and consequence was broken down into 3 categories within the distribution system. The beginning of the supply system, was classified as low risk, being less susceptible to cross-contamination and serving generally the smallest population. The middle of the supply system, the area serving the highest portion of the given population, is classified as high risk, and then the extremity is classified as medium risk due to the assumption of it encountering the maximum number of system failures and serving the second highest population. Temporally, risk and consequence was incorporated based on the findings of a Statistics Canada survey reporting seasonal potable water volumes throughout Canada. So basically, we attributed risk based on the issues that occur if there was a breakdown during that season. So a higher risk was given to summer when water demand is at its highest, and winter was given the lowest risk because that is when water demand is lowest. However, I'm aware this is kind of a simplified method, but this is something that can be tailored given individual utility owners or planners and what they're specifically looking for to add a little more data resolution to their benchmarks. So moving on to the results, this graph shows the CCME Water Quality Index results in yellow and the proposed framework, the RWQI framework, in blue, with the top of the graph representing the 8 sites from Newfoundland and Labrador and the bottom representing 8 sites from Quebec. As you can see in the green box above, some utilities show little differences between the approaches. However, on the bottom in the red box, you can see the variation of others is a little more readily apparent. Since the same water quality data was used for both approaches, we were expecting some similar results, but the differences where they are illustrated represent the incorporation of that additional information in terms of the spatiotemporal variability and the degrees of compliance, non-compliance. Taking the results one step further, I looked at generation 2 broken down into microbiological, chemical, and physical categories. And here in the red box, you can see the difference in that system with a little more resolution, while the CCME Water Quality Index shows scores above 80 for each indicator category, which is a pretty well-functioning system. The results of our framework show differences in both the chemical and physical categories. So while CCME is showing a well-performing system, we're showing something that's a little more average in the medium performance and risk. And then finally, I looked at generation 3 here, which is the individual performance indicators to see how the approaches varied. And the CCME Water Quality Index, which is based almost entirely on either compliance or non-compliance, overestimates performance in some areas, while the RWQI approach incorporates the degrees of compliance along with the spatiotemporal factors to kind of provide a little more comprehensive picture of the overall drinking water quality performance. In conclusion, I've proposed a hierarchical risk-based water quality performance benchmark integrating fuzzy inference systems as an alternative to the more traditional binary performance assessment approaches. And this approach addresses several shortfalls by incorporating severity and the variability to just give better benchmarks and a better view of performance, which is especially important in smaller systems. There are some limitations associated with this. For example, the established universal discourse can vary significantly depending on the user and their motivations. For example, one user may consider the risk of a trihalomethane 4 value as very high, while a second user considers the same value as medium. This isn't an issue as long as there is consistency when comparing results. And moving to the second point here, the results can also vary depending on the fuzzy rules used, which can directly or indirectly result in improper weighting of performance indicators. But once again, as long as there is a consistent approach when comparing, there isn't really an issue there. So I've identified a few future study opportunities, which I think includes more detailed spatial and temporal risk factors, maybe in the form of a pilot study for a few individual utilities. And then also the implementation of specific risk-based methods that can help to quantify full utility performance by including things such as source water quality, customer satisfaction, operational reliability, and operator training and experience. Thank you. I'll switch the screen over here.
All right, thank you, Ty. Okay, we do have one question here for our previous presenter, so I will actually transfer the presentership back to Michal. The question's from Emily Fries, I believe. How did you isolate the NOM in your feed water to concentrate it for later and keep it constant throughout the study? We'll unmute you there. Okay.
Okay, hi. So the way that we concentrated it was through a method that was developed actually at the EPA, and it consists of a two-stage process where initially you take out the large particles and the water goes through ion exchange, and then it goes through a reverse osmosis system to actually do the reconstituting, or to do the concentrating. And so the ion exchange is actually done first so that you won't have fouling of the reverse osmosis membrane. And then we concentrated it by 10 times for the groundwater and 100 times for the surface water. And then we kept this in the refrigerator. And when we reconstituted, then we also added back in ions and bicarbonate and some additional trace compounds. So we'd have sort of a somewhat synthetic water, but the most important thing was this natural source of natural organic matter.
Great, thank you. Let's see, we have a question for Ty, so I will transfer it over again. There we go. Ty, could you please highlight how we can use the idea of spatial and temporal risk factors for emerging disinfection byproducts particularly?
Yeah, am I unmuted here? Yeah, I am.
Yes, you are.
So I think it all comes down to figuring out the exact risk of the contaminant. Basically, as long as we have the sampling information, we can come up with some risk values based on the concentration found in the system at a given point, and then provide a consequence or severity number. We didn't really base anything specifically on health results. I know a lot of the emerging contaminants there are still kind of being studied a little more. So risk isn't based so much on that. It's more based on the from a regulatory standpoint. So any water quality issues. Yeah, so it's more to quantify consequence, but not so much in terms of the health effects, more in terms of the regulatory standpoint. Do I have to transfer back here?
You can hold on just for a moment here. Okay. Are there any other questions for our presenters today? Well, I don't have anything else coming in, so if not, thank you all for attending this March session of the Joint Centers webinar. I really appreciate you taking the time to explore a little bit of the work that's going on at each of the 3 centers, and we'll see you again next month. Thanks a lot, guys.